Herodotus does a very good job of trying to make us understand the ancient world, the world that you knew to be the entire world, which was, of course, was just northern part of Africa, southern part of Europe, and then the west of what we know today is the Asian or the continent of Asia. So it was a very small world, but to Herodotus, that's what was the world. But Herodotus does acknowledge that there was another part of the world that was not known very much to him and to scholars of his time and to the general public. But what becomes apparent as you read through histories is that it seems like Herodotus and other scholars of his time knew more about Africa and to some extent Asia than they knew about Europe. That's very interesting because uh, Greece is in Europe. But as you read the book, it becomes apparent that the Herodotus and other scholars didn't know much about Europe. They only knew the Greece and the land that surrounded Greece, or the lands that surrounded where the Greeks lived, and then the other parts they knew very little. Now, after Darius had come to power, he had decided to conquer or to go to war with a tribe of people known as the Scythians. So now the Scythians was a tribe that lived to the north of Persia. Uh, they occupied much of what we know today as Georgia and to some extent Ukraine, that area, that region. And before he tells us about the actual war that Darius wages against these people, and here the reason why he wanted to fight these people is because these people in the past had come to the region that was occupied by the Medes and waged a war with them, and then there was that that he needed to settle with them. Now, before he tells us about those wars, Herodotus goes into a tangent, and I've mentioned before that he has this habit of going into tangents that become very long. As he tries to give us background information before he explains what, or before he describes the actual events. Now, in these tangents, he tells us about the Scythians, their origin, their history. But then he goes ahead and tells us about other tribes that live next to the Scythians, and he describes people who live to the north of Persia, the Scythians first, and then he tells us other tribes that followed in that order, and then to the west of that, you could say he describes the people who live in what you could call the southern part of Russia today, Western Siberia, Central Europe, to the extent to the west. He described those regions, but he himself acknowledges that he has collected information that is very limited, and he says that he had found very few people who could give information about Central and Northern Europe, to the east of Europe, much of Russia today, that was accurate or that could be taken to be reliable, because there was very little information about those regions. And he says much of the information that was available were mostly hearsay from tribes that bordered those regions. So those tribes will, if you visited them, they will tell you stories of the people who live to the north of them and how they live, and then they will give you, and sometimes this information they give you often seemed like it was unbelievable. Herodotus gives us a few examples. For example, he says he got some information from a tribe of people called as the Isidonians. Maybe it is him directly, or other scholars did go there and collect. He doesn't say whether it was him particularly or somebody else went, but he says there was that information that was available from this tribe of Isidonians. Lived after the Scythians to the north, and they were the tribe that was the last that people from the south, from Greece and Persia, had talked to. Beyond that, they relied on information that the Sidonians provided. And it tells us that the Sidonians told them that the people who live further to the north, maybe you'll say Central Europe, or now go up maybe to the regions that border the what you'll go to maybe Norway or Finland, those regions. And they tell them that the people who live that far are, some of them are cannibals, some tribes of cannibals, and they tell them that they are a tribe of people called the Arimaspi, and the Arimaspi, they describe them as these one-eyed people who live up there. And then they also tell them that there is another tribe of people who live up there who have feet that look like feet of goats. So from these stories, you can see how there was very little knowledge about Central and Northern Europe to people who are in Greece and maybe Middle East, which we call it Middle East now. Herodotus called it the Asia then. Of course, we know today Asia to go to China and to the east. And here's another part that now when it comes to Asia, they knew up to the neighboring tribes to the Persians. To the east, and they knew up, there was a lot of knowledge about India, the regions that is Pakistan today, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, that region used to be called the Bactrian region. There was a lot of information about that region. Many Greek scholars, Egyptian scholars, Persian scholars had traveled to those regions and collected information. But there was very little information about the people who lived further to the east, that's the Chinese. Herodotus does say that he had talked to some tribes and they had told him that the people who lived to the east, the way they describe how they looked could be Chinese or people from Mongolia, those regions, the way they describe their facial, how they look. But there was like very little information about the Herodotus and people of the scholars of his time had very little information about China. Now Japan was even not, could not be even imagined. There was very little. They just knew there was land to the east and they just assumed it was unoccupied. There were no people there. It is interesting because now we know that there were flourishing civilization in that side of the world, but these people didn't know about them. Now, it is interesting that this Herodotus and other scholars seem to have known more about Africa. Even when they knew about Egypt, of course, there was a lot of interaction with Ethiopia and other tribes. There was the Libyan tribes, and the Libya then, the name Libya used to be used to describe the entire of the continent. But Herodotus does go into detail, especially in other parts of the book, especially the earlier parts, where he talks about the tribes that were in. He describes them in detail, their culture, what they ate, how they dressed. Very detailed description of the people of especially North Africa. And even when they did not have a lot of knowledge about the rest of Africa, they seemed to have more understanding than they did of Europe, Central Europe, and Northern Europe. Yeah.